The afternoon sun beat down hard on the red clay roads of Kampala, but inside the community center, the air was cool and filled with the gentle hum of conversation. It was the third Saturday of the month, which meant one thing in this part of town. The big charity fundraiser was happening. Again, David wiped his sweaty palms on his school shorts as he watched his mother Grace arrange the last of the white tablecloths. At 12 years old, he had been helping her at these events for almost 2 years now. The work wasn't hard, mostly carrying trays, clearing dishes, and staying out of the way of important people. But today felt different somehow. The community center had been transformed. Gone were the usual plastic chairs and folding tables. Instead, elegant round tables with crisp white linens filled the main hall. Fresh flowers that must have cost more than his family spent on food in a week sat in the center of each table. Crystal glasses caught the light from the chandelier that someone had installed just for this event. Grace moved between the tables with practiced efficiency, adjusting a fork here, straightening a napkin there. She had been doing catering work since David was tiny, and these monthly fundraisers were some of her best-paying jobs. The money they made here would help pay for David's school fees and maybe even fix the leaky roof back home. "David, come help me with these water glasses," Grace called softly. She never raised her voice at these events. Everything had to be perfect, professional, invisible. As David walked across the polished floor, he noticed something that hadn't been there last month. In the far corner of the hall, positioned where everyone could see it but not be crowded by it, sat a beautiful black piano. Not one of those small electric keyboards he had seen at church sometimes, but a real piano, a grand piano with a lid that reflected the light like still water. He had never seen anything like it up close. The instrument seemed to glow, its dark surface so perfect he could see his own reflection in it. Even from across the room he could see the neat rows of black and white keys waiting silently. Where did that come from? David whispered to his mother as he reached for the glasses. Grace glanced over and smiled. The Belgian embassy donated it last week. They said it was taking up too much space in their storage room. Can you believe that? Too much space. She shook her head in amazement. David couldn't believe it either. Something that beautiful, that expensive, just sitting unused in storage. He wondered what it sounded like. He had heard pianos on the radio sometimes, late at night when the static cleared enough to pick up the classical music station. Those melodies would float through their small house, and David would find himself moving his fingers along to the music, imagining what it would feel like to create those sounds himself. The first guests began arriving around 4 o'clock. David watched them from his position near the kitchen door, where he waited to help serve drinks. They came in expensive cars with drivers, wearing clothes that looked like they had never been worn before. The women's jewelry caught the light as they moved, and the men spoke in confident voices about business deals and government meetings. Mrs. Patterson, the event organizer, glided between the groups in a flowing blue dress. She was one of those expat wives who threw herself into charity work, and everyone respected her because she actually got things done. David had overheard her telling someone that tonight's fundraiser would help build new classrooms in 3 rural schools, but it wasn't the fancy clothes or expensive jewelry that held David's attention. It was the woman who had taken her place at the piano bench. The pianist was a young European woman with short red hair and confident hands. She adjusted the bench, cracked her knuckles once, and began to play. The music that flowed from the piano was unlike anything David had ever experienced in person. It filled every corner of the room, seemed to make the crystal glasses ring in harmony, and somehow made all the background chatter fade away. David found himself edging closer, abandoning his post by the kitchen. His mother caught his eye and nodded slightly. She understood. Grace had always known there was something special about the way David responded to music. Even as a baby, he would stop crying the moment she turned on the radio. As he got older, he would hum along to melodies he had only heard once, getting every note perfect. The pianist's fingers moved across the keys with impossible grace. Sometimes her hands crossed over each other in elaborate patterns. Sometimes they moved together in perfect synchronization. David watched every movement, his own fingers unconsciously copying the motions in the air by his sides. He recognized some of the melodies from the radio. There was that sad, beautiful piece that always came on late at night. He didn't know it was called Moonlight Sonata. There was the fast, exciting one that sounded like water bubbling over rocks. Fur Elise. though David had never heard the name. As the evening progressed, David found himself with more and more excuses to walk past the piano, clearing a table near the back corner, refilling the water pitcher that happened to be stored on a shelf with a perfect view of the keyboard, wiping down chairs that were already spotless. Each time he passed, he noticed something new. The way the pianist's foot worked the pedals, creating different textures in the sound, how her posture remained perfectly straight even during the most complex passages, the slight smile that crossed her face during the beautiful flowing sections, as if she and the music were sharing a private joke. During a brief break between pieces, David overheard her talking to one of the guests about the piano itself. "It's a gorgeous instrument," she was saying in accented English, "probably worth more than most people here make in 5 years. The touch is perfect, the tone is rich and clear. Whoever donated this has no idea what a treasure they gave away. 5 years of wages." David tried to imagine that much money, failed completely, but he could understand treasure. Even from across the room, even knowing nothing about pianos technically, he could sense that this instrument was special. It seemed to be waiting for something, humming with potential even in the quiet moments between songs. As the formal dinner began and the pianist took a longer break, David found himself drawn to the silent piano like metal to a magnet. Grace was busy in the kitchen, helping serve the main course. Most of the guests were focused on their food and the speeches that had begun at the front of the room. The piano sat alone in its corner, patient and mysterious. David stood a few feet away, close enough to see his reflection in the polished black surface, close enough to count the individual keys. 88 of them, he had heard someone mention earlier. 88 keys that could create infinite music. His hands tingled with curiosity. What would it feel like to press just one key? What sound would come out? Would it be as clear and pure as it sounded when the real pianist played? The evening was winding down, and David knew that soon the piano would be covered up again, silent until the next month's event. The thought made his chest feel tight. All that beautiful music just waiting inside this instrument and no one was using it. He took a step closer. David's heart pounded so hard he was sure everyone in the room could hear it. The piano sat just 3 feet away now, close enough that he could see the tiny scratches on some of the keys, where countless fingers had pressed them over the years, close enough to smell the faint scent of wood polish and something else. Something that might have been the lingering essence of all the music that had ever poured from this instrument. He glanced around the room quickly. Most of the guests were still focused on the speeches at the front, wine glasses in hand, nodding along to talk about education funding and community development. Grace was nowhere to be seen, probably still in the kitchen helping with dessert preparation. The pianist had stepped outside onto the terrace with a cup of coffee, her red hair visible through the glass doors. This was his chance. Maybe his only chance, but what if someone saw him? What if he broke something? This piano was worth more money than his family would see in years. What if touching it was against some rule he didn't know about? Rich people had all sorts of rules that poor kids like him were supposed to follow automatically. His hands were sweating now, and he wiped them on his shorts again. He remembered watching the pianist's posture earlier, straight back, relaxed shoulders, hands curved like she was holding invisible tennis balls. He tried to copy that position, feeling awkward and self-conscious. The bench was just the right height. David had noticed that when the pianist adjusted it earlier, she had barely moved it at all. He was tall for his age, all arms and legs that his mother said he hadn't grown into yet. Maybe, just maybe, he was the right height too. He sat down slowly as if the bench might collapse under him or alarm bells might start ringing. Nothing happened. The room continued its gentle hum of conversation. No one turned to stare at the boy who didn't belong. The keys looked different up close. The white ones weren't pure white. They had a slight cream color, warm and inviting. The black keys were positioned in groups of 2s and 3s, creating a pattern that suddenly made sense to him in a way he couldn't explain. It was like seeing a code he had always known how to read. David raised his hands over the keyboard, then pulled them back. What if he pressed too hard? What if the sound was terrible and everyone turned to look? What if he embarrassed his mother? But stronger than the fear was something else, a pull he had been feeling for months every time he heard piano music on the radio. It was like hunger, but not for food. It was hunger for those sounds, for the chance to create something beautiful instead of just listening to it drift through the static. He thought about all those nights lying in bed, moving his fingers along to melodies only he could hear, All those times he had drawn piano keys on pieces of cardboard, pressing them silently while imagining what they might sound like. All those dreams of sitting exactly where he was sitting now. His right index finger came down gently on middle C. The note rang out clear and pure, so much richer than anything he had imagined. It seemed to hang in the air for a long moment before fading away. David held his breath, waiting for someone to shout at him, but the conversations continued undisturbed. The note had been soft enough that only he had really heard it. Encouraged, he pressed another key, then another. The sounds were even more beautiful than the radio had promised. Each note seemed to have layers, a bright surface and a warm depth underneath. His fingers found their way to a simple melody he had heard many times. Something gentle and flowing that the late-night classical station played often. The melody emerged hesitantly at first, with long pauses between notes as David searched for the right keys. But his ear guided him correctly each time. When a note sounded wrong, he would adjust up or down until it felt right. And somehow, impossibly, it did feel right. His fingers seemed to know where to go even though his mind didn't understand how. As his confidence grew, the pauses between notes grew shorter. The melody began to flow more naturally, each note connecting to the next like water finding its course downhill. David's left hand, which had been resting uselessly in his lap, began to twitch along with the rhythm. Without thinking about it, he brought it up to the keys and started adding simple bass notes. He had no idea what he was doing, but it sounded good. It sounded like the music he heard in his dreams. The piece he was playing was one he had heard dozens of times on the radio. He didn't know it was called Clair de Lune by Debussy. He just knew it was the song that always made him feel like floating, like drifting on calm water under moonlight, and now impossibly, that same feeling was flowing from his own fingers. The notes came easier now, his hands finding a rhythm that felt as natural as walking. His posture straightened without him thinking about it. His shoulders relaxed, his wrists found the right angle. It was as if the piano was teaching him how to play it, guiding his movements through the music itself. David lost himself in the sound. The fancy room around him faded away. The worries about being caught, about not belonging, about breaking something expensive, all of it disappeared. There was only the music and the incredible sensation of creating something beautiful with his own hands. His fingers moved faster now, more confidently. The melody soared and dipped, whispered and sang. He added little decorations he had heard the radio pianists use, runs and trills that his fingers somehow knew how to execute. When he made a mistake, he would correct it smoothly and keep going, as if the error had been intentional. The piano responded to every subtle change in his touch. When he pressed harder, the sound grew fuller and more dramatic. When he played softly, the notes became gentle whispers that seemed to float in the air. It was like having a conversation with the instrument, each of them listening and responding to the other. David was so absorbed in the music that he didn't notice when the conversations in the room began to quiet. He didn't see the first guest turn toward the piano corner with a puzzled expression. He didn't notice when the pianist on the terrace stopped mid-sentence and cocked her head toward the glass doors, her coffee cup frozen halfway to her lips. He was lost in the melody, in the incredible joy of finally making the music that had been trapped inside his head for so long. His eyes were closed now, his face peaceful and concentrated, his hands moving across the keys with growing confidence and grace. The last notes of the piece hung in the air like golden threads, fading slowly into silence. David opened his eyes, a smile spreading across his face. He had done it. He had actually played the piano. That's when he noticed the silence in the room was different now. Complete. Absolute. And everyone was staring at him. The silence stretched like a held breath. David's hands froze above the keys, his smile fading as he took in the scene around him. Every single person in the room had stopped what they were doing. Conversations had died mid-sentence. Wine glasses hung suspended halfway to lips. Even the servers carrying trays had stopped moving, balancing their loads while staring at the boy at the piano. Heat rushed to David's cheeks. What had he done? This was exactly what he had been afraid of, making a scene, drawing attention, embarrassing his mother. He started to stand up from the bench, ready to mumble an apology and disappear into the kitchen where he belonged. But before he could move, something unexpected happened. One person began to clap. It was Mrs. Henderson, an elderly British woman who attended every charity event and always sat at the same table near the front. Her applause was slow and deliberate, each clap distinct and purposeful. Within seconds, others joined in, then more. Then everyone. The applause swelled through the room like a wave, growing stronger and more enthusiastic with each passing moment. David sat frozen on the bench, completely overwhelmed. This wasn't the polite, brief clapping he had heard after the professional pianist finished her pieces earlier. This was something different, surprised, genuine, amazed. "Who is that boy?" He heard someone whisper loudly. "Where did he learn to play like that?" came another voice. "Is he part of the program tonight?" David's panic was replaced by confusion. They weren't angry. They weren't telling him to get away from the expensive piano. They were impressed, but that couldn't be right. He was just a kid who helped his mother at these events. He wasn't a real musician. Through the glass doors, he saw the red-haired pianist drop her coffee cup. It shattered on the terrace tiles, but she didn't seem to notice. She was already pushing through the doors, moving quickly toward the piano with an expression David couldn't read. "Play something else," called out a man in an expensive suit from one of the front tables. "Please don't stop." Others echoed the request. "Yes, play more." "That was incredible. We want to hear another piece." David looked around desperately for his mother, finally spotting Grace in the doorway to the kitchen. Instead of the embarrassed or worried expression he expected, she was smiling. Not just smiling, beaming with pride, tears glistening in her eyes. She nodded at him encouragingly and mouthed the words, "It's okay." The pianist reached the piano corner, slightly out of breath. "I'm Anna," she said quietly, kneeling down beside the bench so she was at David's eye level. "What you just played? That was beautiful. Where did you study piano?" I didn't," David stammered. "I just listen to the radio sometimes." Anna's eyes widened. "You learned that piece from the radio?" "That was Debussy. Clair de Lune." It's not an easy piece, even for students who have been playing for years. By now, more people had gathered around the piano. What had started as a scattered audience across the room was becoming a proper crowd. Everyone pushing closer to get a better look at the boy who had just stunned them all. "How long have you been playing?" asked Dr. Phillips, a tall woman with gray hair who taught music at the local university. David had seen her at these events before, but she had never spoken to him. "I haven't," David said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I mean, I've never played a real piano before, just now." A murmur rippled through the crowd. "Never played before? That's impossible. He must be joking." "Show us," Anna said gently. "Can you play something else?" "Anything you want." David's hands were shaking now, but not from fear anymore. It was excitement, pure and electric. These people, these important, educated, wealthy people, wanted to hear him play. They thought he was good enough to listen to. He thought about the other melodies that lived in his head, the ones that drifted through their small house late at night when the radio reception was clear. There was one piece in particular, something energetic and joyful that always made him want to move his whole body along with the rhythm. His fingers found the opening notes of Mozart's Turkish March, though he didn't know the composer's name or the piece's title. He just knew it as the happy running song from the radio. This time he didn't start hesitantly. The earlier success had given him confidence, and the encouragement from the crowd had melted away his fear. The melody bounced and danced under his fingers, each note clear and precise. His left hand found the rhythm naturally, creating a foundation for the playful melody his right hand was spinning out. The crowd pressed closer, some people holding up their phones to record what they were witnessing. David was too absorbed in the music to notice, his whole body swaying slightly with the rhythm, his face lit up with pure joy. "This is extraordinary," Dr. Phillips whispered to Anna. "Look at his technique, his posture, the way he phrases the music. This isn't beginner's luck. This is raw talent." Anna nodded, her eyes never leaving David's hands. "I've been playing for 20 years, teaching for 10. I've never seen anything like this. He's playing entirely by ear, but his musical instincts are perfect. Listen to how he handles the dynamics, the way he shapes the phrases." The piece built to its exciting climax, David's fingers flying over the keys with increasing confidence and speed. The crowd was completely silent now except for the occasional gasp of amazement. Even the kitchen staff had emerged to watch, Grace among them, her hand pressed to her heart. As the final notes rang out, the applause was immediate and thunderous. But this time David didn't freeze. He turned on the bench to face his audience, a huge grin spreading across his face. For the first time in his life, he felt like he belonged somewhere special. "More," someone shouted from the back of the crowd. "Play more. What else can you play?" Anna asked, sitting down on the edge of the piano bench beside him. David thought for a moment. "There's this one piece. It's very sad and slow. It makes me think of rain." Without waiting for permission, his hands found the opening chords of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. The melancholy melody filled the room like a prayer, each note carefully placed, the silences between them as important as the sounds themselves. The crowd had grown even larger now. Word was spreading through the terrace and garden areas. Something incredible was happening inside. People were abandoning their conversations and desserts to witness what many of them would later describe as the most remarkable thing they had ever seen. But it wasn't just the technical skill that amazed them. It was the emotion David put into the music, the way he seemed to understand not just the notes but the soul of each piece. At 12 years old, with no formal training, he was playing with the kind of musical maturity that usually took decades to develop. When the Chopin piece ended, the silence that followed was different from before. It was reverent, almost sacred. Then Dr. Phillips stepped forward, her voice carrying clearly through the quiet room. "Young man," she said, "what's your name?" "David," the boy answered, his voice still shaky from the adrenaline of performing. "David Kalema," Dr. Phillips smiled warmly. "Well, David Kalema, you have just given us one of the most remarkable performances I've witnessed in 30 years of music education. Where do you study piano?" David glanced toward his mother, who had made her way through the crowd and now stood just a few feet away. Grace nodded encouragingly, giving him permission to tell his story. "I don't study anywhere," David said quietly. "I've never had lessons. This is the first time I've ever touched a real piano." The murmur that rippled through the crowd was louder this time, filled with disbelief and amazement. Anna, still sitting beside him on the bench, stared at him with wide eyes. "That's impossible," said a man in the crowd.
"Nobody plays like that without training. How did you learn those pieces?"
Dr. Phillips asked gently. "They're quite advanced, even for students who have been playing for years." David took a deep breath. This was the part he was embarrassed about, the part that made him feel different from other kids. "I listen to the radio at night. There's a station that plays classical music late, when the static isn't too bad. I hear the songs and then I remember them. All of them." "You memorize them just by listening?" Anna asked, her voice filled with wonder. "I can't help it," David said, looking down at his hands. "When I hear a melody, it gets stuck in my head. Sometimes I'll hear a piece once and I can hum the whole thing the next day. My mother says I've always been like that, even when I was little." Grace stepped forward, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "He's telling the truth. Even as a baby, David would stop crying the moment I turned on music. When he was 3 or 4, he would hum along to songs he'd only heard once, getting every note perfect. I thought all children could do that." "They can't," Dr. Phillips said softly. "What David has is called perfect pitch. It's extremely rare, maybe 1 in 10,000 people, but even perfect pitch doesn't explain the musical understanding he just demonstrated." "There's more," Grace continued, pride and emotion making her voice thick. "Show them, David. Tell them about your practice." David's cheeks reddened with embarrassment. "I made keyboards out of cardboard," he admitted. "I drew the keys and practiced on them. I know it sounds stupid, but I would listen to the radio and move my fingers along with the music, pretending I was playing." The crowd had grown completely silent, hanging on every word. Several people were openly wiping their eyes. "For how long?" Anna asked. "About 3 years," David said. "Maybe longer. I started when I was 9, I think. I found a picture of a piano keyboard in an old magazine at school, and I copied it onto a piece of cardboard. Then I made bigger ones at home." 3 years of practicing on cardboard keyboards, Dr. Phillips repeated slowly, as if trying to make sense of what she was hearing. "And you've been memorizing classical pieces from a radio with poor reception." "The reception is better at night," David said helpfully. "Especially when it rains. That's when I can hear the music most clearly." Anna stood up from the bench and began pacing, running her hands through her red hair. "This is extraordinary. Beyond extraordinary. David, do you realize that some of the pieces you just played take students months to learn? Years even?" "I didn't know they were hard," David said honestly. "They just sounded beautiful on the radio. I wanted to know what it would feel like to make those sounds myself." How many pieces do you think you know? Dr. Phillips asked. David thought about it seriously. Maybe 50 or more. I hear new ones all the time, and once they're in my head, they don't go away. There's one I heard last week that I really want to try. It has a part where both hands play the same melody but at different times, like they're chasing each other. A canon, Anna said automatically. You're describing a canon? That's advanced compositional technique. I don't know the names for things, David said apologetically. I just know how they sound. A well-dressed woman near the back of the crowd raised her voice. What does your family think about your talent? Are they musical too? Grace shook her head. I can barely carry a tune. David's father passed away when David was 7, but he wasn't musical either. This gift, it came from somewhere else, maybe from God. What do you want to be when you grow up, David? Asked Dr. Phillips. David's answer was immediate and certain. I want to play piano. Real piano like this one. I want to learn all the songs I hear on the radio and maybe write some of my own someday. You want to compose music too? Anna asked, excitement growing in her voice. Sometimes I hear melodies in my dreams, David explained. Beautiful ones that I've never heard on the radio. When I wake up, I try to remember them, but I have no way to play them or write them down. They just stay in my head. The crowd exchanged meaningful looks. Several people were already pulling out their phones, and not just to record videos. They were making calls, sending messages, reaching out to contacts in the music world. Mrs. Patterson, the event organizer, pushed through to the front of the crowd. David, would you be willing to play one more piece for us? Something that shows your range? David nodded eagerly. He was no longer nervous. The music had always been his safe place, and now he had found his voice. His hands moved to the keys and began the opening of Bach's Invention No. 1, a piece that required both hands to play independent melodies simultaneously. As the intricate music flowed from the piano, conversations were happening in hushed tones around the room. Dr. Phillips was speaking rapidly to someone on her phone. Anna was texting furiously. Several guests were already discussing scholarship opportunities, music schools, and the need to get David proper training immediately. But David was lost in the music again, unaware of the wheels that were already turning around him. His face was peaceful and concentrated, his hands moving with the kind of natural grace that couldn't be taught. He was simply a 12-year-old boy doing what he loved most in the world, unaware that his life was about to change forever. When the Bach piece ended, the applause was longer and more emotional than before. But more importantly, David could see something different in the faces around him. It wasn't just appreciation for a good performance. It was recognition. These people understood that they had witnessed something truly special, something that might happen once in a generation, and they were already planning to do something about it. What happened next could only be described as magic, but not the kind you see in fairy tales. This was real-world magic, the kind that happens when human kindness meets extraordinary talent. Within minutes of David's final performance, Mrs. Patterson was on her phone with the director of the Kampala Music Academy. Dr. Phillips had called her colleague at the Royal Conservatory in London. Anna was texting her former professor, who now taught at a prestigious music school in South Africa. The room buzzed with excited conversations and urgent phone calls. But the real magic started with something much simpler. David, said Mr. Thompson, a businessman who had been quietly watching from the back of the crowd. My daughter took piano lessons for 6 years and barely learned what you just played in one evening. We have a piano at home that nobody uses anymore. Would your family like to have it? Before David could even process what was being offered, more voices joined in. I'd like to pay for his first year of lessons, announced Mrs. Chen, an expatriate wife who had been recording everything on her phone. The music store downtown, I know the owner. I can get him books, sheet music, whatever he needs, added another guest. My brother is a piano tuner. I'll make sure the donated piano is in perfect condition, called out someone else. Grace stood in the middle of it all, tears streaming down her face, overwhelmed by the generosity of strangers. David looked between all these people offering to help him, hardly believing this was really happening, but the biggest magic was yet to come. Mrs. Chen had been recording David's performance on her phone, and within an hour of leaving the charity event, she had posted the video on social media with the caption, 12-year-old boy plays piano for first time, learned everything from radio. Watch until the end. By the next morning, the video had been shared 3,000 times. By the end of the week, it had reached 500,000 views. People from around the world were commenting, sharing their amazement, and asking how they could help. The video caught the attention of Jackson Williams, a famous pianist who had grown up poor in Jamaica and now performed with orchestras worldwide. He shared the video with his 2 million followers, adding, "This is what pure talent looks like. This boy needs our help to reach his potential." Suddenly, David's story was everywhere. News stations in Uganda picked it up first, then international media followed. The BBC, CNN, and other major networks all ran stories about the piano prodigy from Kampala. Each story brought more attention, more offers of help, more opportunities. 3 weeks after that life-changing evening at the community center, David sat at a beautiful upright piano in his family's small living room. It was the piano Mr. Thompson had promised, delivered and tuned to perfection. But it wasn't the only change in their lives. The Kampala Music Academy had offered David a full scholarship. A local piano teacher, inspired by his story, had volunteered to give him lessons twice a week. A music store had donated books of sheet music, real printed, music that would help David learn to read notes, instead of relying only on his ear. But perhaps the most amazing change was the envelope that arrived from New York. "It's from the Juilliard School," Grace said, her hand shaking as she opened the thick packet. "They want to offer David a scholarship for their summer youth program. All expenses paid. They saw the video and want to evaluate his potential." David was practicing scales when she told him the news, his hands stilled on the keys. Juilliard was the school he had heard famous pianists mention in interviews on the radio. It was the kind of place he had never dreamed he could attend. "Do you want to go?" Grace asked gently. David's answer was immediate. "Yes, but only if you can come with me." "They're providing for both of us," Grace said, smiling through her tears. "We're going to New York, David." 6 months later, David stood on the stage of the Uganda National Theater, wearing a crisp white shirt and black pants that had been donated by a local tailor who had heard his story. The theater was packed, not just with the usual classical music audience, but with people from all walks of life who had followed his journey. His fingers moved across the grand piano with confidence born of proper training and endless practice. The piece he was playing was Rachmaninoff's Prelude in C-Or minor, a complex, passionate work that he had learned to read from sheet music, but understood with the same intuitive musicality that had amazed everyone that first night. In the audience, Grace watched with pride. Beside her sat Anna, the red-haired pianist who had become David's mentor and friend. Dr. Phillips was there too, along with many of the people who had been at that charity fundraiser and witnessed the beginning of this incredible journey. But the front row was reserved for a special group, 20 children from local schools who had shown musical talent but had never had access to instruments or lessons. David's story had inspired the creation of a music program for underprivileged youth, funded by donations from around the world that had poured in after his videos went viral. When David finished the Rachmaninoff, the applause was thunderous. But instead of taking a bow and leaving the stage, he remained at the piano. "Before I finish tonight," he said into the microphone, "I want to play something special. This is a melody I've been hearing in my dreams for years. I finally learned how to write it down, and tonight is the first time anyone else will hear it." The original composition that flowed from David's fingers was unlike anything the audience had heard before. It wove together the classical techniques he had mastered with the rhythms and melodies of traditional Ugandan music. It was sophisticated yet accessible, complex yet emotional. It was David's own voice, finally finding its full expression. As the last notes faded away, the audience rose to their feet. But David's eyes were on those 20 children in the front row, seeing in their faces the same hunger for music that he had carried for so many years. After the concert, a little girl approached him shyly. "I want to learn piano like you," she said, "but we don't have one at home." David knelt down to her level, remembering what it felt like to dream of touching real piano keys. "Do you have cardboard?" he asked with a smile. The girl nodded. "Then you can start learning today. I'll show you how." And in that moment, surrounded by the warmth of family, friends, and music, David understood that the real magic hadn't been in becoming famous or getting opportunities. The real magic was in sharing the gift that had been given to him, ensuring that other children with dreams as big as his would have the chance to pursue them too. The boy who had once served drinks to wealthy strangers was now inspiring a new generation of young musicians. His story had become proof that talent can bloom anywhere, that dreams can come true with determination and the kindness of others, and that sometimes the most beautiful music comes from the most unexpected places.